Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. Dana White, in a recent interview, hinted at the UFC potentially doing Stipe Miocic versus Jon Jones for the interim heavyweight title this summer. And at first, when I heard this news, I got really excited because I want to see Jon Jones debut at heavyweight. But as I started to think about it more and unpack it more, I really thought I needed to make a video because the real reason the UFC is booking this is not being talked about too much. I've seen some people speculate on it, but I haven't seen it talked about a lot. When this came out, it was a lot of positive feedback, a lot of people wanting to see Stipe Miocic versus Jon Jones. And when I initially saw the news, I was excited. But as I started to think about it, now I kind of hate it. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But first off, let's talk about what I like about this fight. This fight is amazing stylistically. You have Stipe Miocic, who is the consensus UFC greatest heavyweight of all time. Then you have Jon Jones, the consensus greatest light heavyweight of all time. You have two guys who are very well-rounded. I mean, Jon Jones is one of my favorite fighters to watch. Has such a high fight IQ. It's just great everywhere. He has submission ability. He has great offensive wrestling, defensive wrestling. He has great striking, and he has a great variety of attack. Then you have Stipe Miocic, who has the one-punch KO power. He's not your stereotypical 265-pound heavyweight like Francis Ngannou or Alistair Overeem when he used to be in the UFC, or some of these other guys who are just massive heavyweights. You have a very athletic guy in Stipe Miocic who has good wrestling, has good hands, has good power, has great stamina. He's not going to gas out. I mean, what more can you ask for in a fight? And they're both such high-level fighters. So I do love this fight, but I do kind of hate it as well. And I'm going to get to that in a second. But, you know, just the division itself, the first thing I kind of hate about it is the potential for an interim title. You know, we had Stipe Miocic versus Francis Ngannou almost in April of 2021. It was the tail end of March of 2021. Francis Ngannou brutally KO'd Stipe Miocic in that fight to win the UFC heavyweight title. Then all of a sudden, you know, a couple months later, 4 months later, essentially, Francis Ngannou said, I can't be ready till September. UFC says we need a fight for August. So they make an interim title. And I get interim titles are part of the sport, but we don't need to force an interim title every chance we get. They did the Ciryl Gane versus Derek Lewis, the two next most deserving contenders in the heavyweight division. Ciryl Gane goes out there, beats up Derek Lewis, finishes him in the later rounds. And then Ciryl Gane moves on to fight Francis Ngannou in January of this year. Very competitive fight. Francis Ngannou wins the decision, but he has the knee injury. And so he has to have surgery. And supposedly he's going to be out about 9 months. He had the surgery, I think, the tail end of January. So that puts him returning the tail end of 2022. But I hated that interim title fight. Why not just do, and I know the UFC likes to have titles on the line, but why not just do Derek Lewis versus Ciryl Gane? No interim title. Winner can fight Francis Ngannou. But at some point, when you just start throwing these interim titles fights out left and right, and you know it hasn't been an activity, you have a champion that's only been out 3 or 4 months, and you're putting an interim title fight on the line, it just makes absolutely no sense in that case. I'm not necessarily talking about in this case because it's a little bit longer period of time, but we'll talk about that in a second. But for me, the number one thing I hate about this fight is you have Jon Jones who, regardless of what you think about the Dominic Reyes fight, he last fought February of 2020 against Dominic Reyes, and he defeated Dominic Reyes by decision. And a lot of people believe that Jon Jones lost that fight. But you look at the judges' scorecards, you look at his official record, he never lost his light heavyweight title to Dominic Reyes. He vacated the belt. And for me, if he's going to vacate the belt and go up to heavyweight, which he's been talking about since 2020, I think he needs to fight the heavyweight champion. And I get it. If Jon Jones can't beat Stipe, maybe he can't beat Francis. But I think if Francis Ngannou can return the end of this year, you've already had Jon Jones sit out, or he, you know, by choice, whatever you want to say, contract negotiations, whatever it may be. Jon Jones has already sat out for over 2 years at this point. What's another 4 or 5 months to have him fight Francis Ngannou at the end of the year? I think Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones is probably the biggest fight the UFC could make. And that's the real reason why I hate it, because if Jon Jones goes out there, fights Stipe Miocic, and loses, then we're just going to get Stipe Miocic versus Francis Ngannou 3. And while that's still a very intriguing fight because you had Stipe kind of dominate him in the first fight, then you have Francis Ngannou steamroll Stipe in the second fight, I'd rather see Jon Jones tested against the champion to begin and not Stipe Miocic, who has just been brutally KO'd by Francis Ngannou in March of last year. And then also, I get it. Stipe Miocic is the GOAT heavyweight of the UFC. But the guy is just perpetually sitting out over and over and over again. And that's the other thing about the interim heavyweight title. We've had years that have gone by where the champion has only defended once. Sometimes with Cain Velasquez, I think there was at least a year period where he didn't even defend and there wasn't an interim belt. I don't remember specifically, but the years of Stipe versus DC once a year, we had that. And now we're going to have 2 interim heavyweights, titles in the span of a year, basically. If we make it this summer, I get it. If they do Jon Jones versus Stipe, they have to do an interim heavyweight title fight. But I just don't like it. I get this one is a little bit more realistic just because of the timetable for Francis Ngannou. He's going to be out a little bit longer, at least, probably 10 to 12 months since January. But still, I just hate the interim title fight. But also on top of that, when you really start to think about this, and I'm sure some of you guys understand what I was hinting at in the beginning, the real reason the UFC is booking this fight is for the legitimacy of the UFC heavyweight division. And what I mean by that is from their point of view, you have Francis Ngannou, who fought out his contract. He has no fights left on his UFC deal. His last fight against Ciryl Gane was his last fight on his UFC contract. And what happened since he won that fight, he was automatically extended for 1 year or 3 fights, I believe. And what happens is now Francis Ngannou either has to sit out and wait, and then he can go try to negotiate with other organizations and potentially get signed, but then the UFC has the rights to match if the UFC is unable to come to a deal with Francis Ngannou. So what I really believe they want to do is they want to book Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. If Stipe's able to beat Jon Jones, then he kind of earns his legitimacy back. You can say, oh, well, he lost to Francis Ngannou, but that was all the way back in March of 2021. And since then, he defeated the consensus GOAT light heavyweight who moved up to heavyweight finally after all this talk. And he went out there and beat him. If you have Jon Jones, who then defeats Stipe Miocic, you have a guy who's never lost to Francis Ngannou. And on top of that, you have all the legacy that he has from light heavyweight as the consensus GOAT of light heavyweight. And then on top of that, you have the negotiating power now with Francis Ngannou. I believe if you have Jon Jones as a heavyweight champion, which, I don't know if that's a good or bad thing for the UFC because of all the trouble he's constantly in, but they have a little bit of that negotiating power back from Francis Ngannou because now they can say, okay, Francis, you know what? Go, you can walk, you can go to another organization, and then they'll elevate Jon Jones to the undisputed heavyweight champion, or they'll elevate Stipe Miocic to the undisputed heavyweight champion. So I really believe this interim title, as well as, it was the same thing with the Derek Lewis, Ciryl Gane. I believe it's about negotiating power with Francis Ngannou because UFC and Ngannou have been going back for what seems like forever at this point in time about contract negotiations because there's no way the UFC wanted to let him fight out his deal. They don't like to let anybody fight out their deal. And the fact their heavyweight champion, one of the most important fighters on their entire roster, has now fought out his deal, there's no way the UFC, Dana White's not happy about that. Dana White wasn't even there to put the belt on Francis Ngannou. I don't believe that story. He was dealing with something in the back. You have your heavyweight champion in one of the biggest heavyweight fights of all time, regardless if it turned out to be a little bit lackluster, and you weren't there to wrap the belt around him. There's a reason for that, and that's because of the contract negotiations. There's been so much open back and forth between Ngannou's manager, Dana White, talking crap back and forth. The UFC wants to limit Francis Ngannou's negotiating power as much as physically possible. They crown another champion. They'll say, look, Francis, if you don't want to fight for us, that's fine. You've been out for a while. We got Jones as champion, or we got Stipe as champion. And I get if Stipe's there, it's like, oh, well, Ngannou already, steamrolled him. But they would spin that somehow and say, oh, that was a while ago, and he's since picked up a win against the light heavyweight, great Jon Jones. And they just would use that as negotiating power. And I think that's the real reason that the UFC is consistently putting on interim title fights for the heavyweight division with Francis Ngannou. If this was Conor McGregor, look at Conor McGregor. How long was he gone before they finally stripped him of the belt or made an interim belt? I don't remember the exact specifics and dates. But there's no way, their champion, if it was Conor McGregor, he's going to be out for 10 months. Oh, we're going to put an interim title in line. There's no way. I don't think they would do it at all, but they're doing it in this case. It's because they want to gain some of that leverage back from Francis Ngannou. At the end of the day, I really hope that the UFC keeps Francis Ngannou, and I get that the Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic fight is amazing. It's very compelling. But for me, I'd rather wait till the end of the year and do Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. I believe that's one of the biggest fights the UFC can make. And, I get it. I still like the Jones versus Stipe, but I am dying to see Ngannou versus, Jones. And I get it. If Jones beats Stipe, then the Ngannou-Jones fight just gets even bigger. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Which fight would you rather see? Would you rather see Jones versus Stipe this summer? Or would you rather the UFC wait and make Jones versus Ngannou the end of this year or the very early stages of 2023? Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.